now listening to Sanity at the Movies, Stargazing Edition. Welcome to Sanity at the Movies. My name is Nathan Albertson, your humble and obedient host, joined by my good friends, the Booketing crew today. We got Brandon Chasteen there. Hey. He's the scholar who's the baller of reading over there on the Booketing. He's also...
I'm on the Booketing.
What's that?
Right now I'm on the Booketing?
No, over there on the Booketing, over there on that other podcast.
Oh, yeah.
He's also a guy that has been known to make his eyeballs point in the direction of a cinematic thing.
That's right, occasionally.
The insight of an Obi-Wan Kenobi and the wisdom of a Yoda and the body of a
I had a feeling it was going there, Nathan.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Brandon's getting more healthy all the time. He likes to go to the Gym. It's good times for Brandon Chasteen. And speaking of fit, svelte, and handsome, I'm
Nathan
your humble and obedient host.
Yeah, there we go.
Yep. You're calling them all today,
Looks
Brandon.
like Han Solo himself.
No. Speaking of fit, svelte, and handsome, what Star Wars character would Jake be, Brandon?
We may have just said it. Han Solo?
Han Solo? Jake's not...
I've got a bad feeling about this.
I don't think of Jake as particularly roguish. Jake has many fine qualities. Roguishness, not necessarily one of them.
He would be...
But he's not as square as Luke Skywalker either. Maybe he's Anakin. You think is he going to go bad and betray us all and kill the younglings?
If I could be Clone Wars Anakin and live there and not go bad, that'd be pretty...
I can see
that'd be pretty awesome.
He's Anakin who never went bad.
Yeah, Clone Wars Anakin, the one that...
Clone Wars Anakin, yeah.
There we go.
So who am I? I'm Jabba the Hutt.
No. You're like Yoda. I don't know.
I'm Yoda? Okay.
Sure.
I'll be Yoda.
You can be Yoda. Yoda's...
Obi-Wan?
Yoda's kind of a drag. So is Obi-Wan. The mentors are also boring in Star Wars.
Can I be young Obi-Wan from the original series?
Sure.
From whatever there.
Why not?
Thanks.
All right, guys, we're talking about A New Hope, 1977's classic work of cinema, directed by George Lucas, Star Wars, A New Hope. You guys excited about this?
Yeah.
So very excited.
I am too.
So excited to... What's that line from that robot that you want to just kill? So happy.
So glad to be talking. Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah. That stupid robot from Solo.
Yeah.
The feminist
robot.
Yeah.
Fembot.
The Fembot.
Now, Nathan.
Yes,
Better
sir.
fit in an Austin Powers film anyway.
I don't think I realized this was directed by George Lucas.
Didn't you, Brandon?
No.
Well, it was.
Really?
Yeah.
That surprises me. I knew the other two weren't.
No. George Lucas generally functioned as an executive producer on these movies and was the creative visionary behind them through the sixth movie, episode 3, through the first 6 films that were released. But he only directed of the original trilogy, the first one.
Really?
And was very famed as a director that wasn't particularly... If you read between the lines, I mean, the hype and you always have to read between the lines with these classic films because there's very few people that are willing to go on record and tell you how terrible it really was. It's all, the mythology of Hollywood. Hollywood has always been about self myth making. You won't find an industry where there's just more hype and more. I mean, obviously, why wouldn't it? It's a hype machine.
Yeah,
that's what it exists to do, is to hype and promote. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that it's sometimes hard to get the straight story. But reading between the lines, it seems like George Lucas is a pretty, and I don't want to say a difficult man, like he's angry and ranting and raving, but more like he's shy and a little bit disengaged and the kind of, actors
not as assertive as you need a director to be.
Well, they would say like he would watch from the monitor and then he'd say, okay, do that one a little faster. That'd be a George Lucas direction, which, if you're Alec Guinness or somebody like that, a Royal Shakespeare, okay, and you gave me this weird dialogue and you're not going to help me like
understand what you want, what's behind it.
But actually, like Tim Burton, like so many directors, I don't know why Tim Burton popped into my head, but he's a visualist, right? He cares about what it looks. He actually does care about things like to George Lucas's mind. I think what he really cares about is, well, let's do that a little faster, because he's thinking in terms of rhythm, he's thinking in terms of pace, he's thinking about what it's going to look like edited together. And actually, the quintessential example of this was Hitchcock. Hitchcock's actors always felt like, and went on record, said that they felt like pawns, like they were there to do his will and to
puppets.
And not to act. Like a really great director, an actor's director, he will talk to you and coddle you and get you to sort of feel the right way. And he'll design the scene around the way that you're feeling. Martin Scorsese, if he's working with Robert De Niro, he'll say, okay, Bob, let's do another one. And how do you feel about this? You want to play it this way this time? And they'll have a lot of fun and they'll spend all day, playing in the sandbox together. George Lucas, not like that at all. He has a visual thing in his mind, so he just wants his little puppets, as you said, Jake, to move from here to there. Not a actor's director, as you can definitely tell.
In all the movies that he directs.
The movies that he directs, but specifically. Well,
I mean, it'll show up, I think, again in the 1 through 3 as well.
Absolutely. In 1 through 3, it's much less mitigated. I think he knew he was smart in the way that he worked within his own limitations in the first one, and then he got some really good directors, including Irvin Kershner, who just brought Empire Strikes Back to life. All those characters feel so much richer, and everybody loves Empire Strikes Back primarily because of the character work, I think. Just the little moments, the I know, and things like that. All the romance between Han Solo and Leia. George Lucas wouldn't be capable of doing that stuff to save his life.
He would be telling Leia how much her skin is like the sand.
Right. Exactly. Anakin's
it's
love
not
making.
Like the sand.
No,
he hates
that's
the sand.
Right. Well, maybe Han Solo loves the sand.
It's coarse.
Right.
Not like you.
Well, if you watch the behind the scenes, this is all a tangent, but if you watch the behind the scenes stuff of the prequel trilogy, what you see is a man with a Starbucks coffee sitting in a chair, looking at a monitor, looks pretty disengaged, and you see a bunch of actors flailing around on green screens. And then you hear like voiceover of people talking about how magical it was. But reading between the lines, you can kind of start to understand why the prequels are the way they are. Because
I was reading something about the director of Birdman.
Birdman, yeah.
Who's
I forget some Spanish name.
Inarritu?
Yeah, Inarritu.
And he was saying that he thinks he has mild ADHD or something because for him, he can go from one thing to another and just be juggling all these different aspects of the script, the actors, and the other things that a director needs to be juggling. It makes me almost think that a person who is a successful director is probably someone who could have also been a successful CEO or something.
I think that's absolutely true. And the really great ones like Spielberg is nothing if not a savvy businessman and a savvy self-promoter. You see him in interviews. He's on a mission. He knows what he has to say. He's just a really good, he's almost a good producer first, and then a great director second. But he's the complete package. A lot of these guys are just they're good administrators.
Yeah.
And if they're good self-promoters, a good self-promoter / administrator is really what you look for a director of one of these franchise kinds of films.
That was interesting because we think of the director as just being like this artist.
Right.
But they have to have a bit more than that too. They can't just be like a novelist.
Well, the interesting thing that the Marvel model now is really interesting because what they will get is indie directors like the Russo brothers who come from TV and come from mumblecore indie movies, and they will get them to do the character work. And then they have this machine that administrates and produces the action scenes.
Yep.
And so they can get someone like, what's his face, Wahiti or whatever that guy's name is. They can get somebody clever to work with the actors and
figure out how to get the best out of Chris Hemsworth as Thor, which nobody had ever done before.
Right, right. Exactly. And that's really smart. And that's,
figure out how to build chemistry between Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson and Mark Ruffalo.
Yeah, and if George Lucas had done that with the prequels, I think that they would be probably successes because George Lucas is a good architect and he's a good administrator and he's a good visionary. What he's not is a good director of actors or a good screenwriter. And so if he just outsourced or delegated those jobs, I think he would have been fine. And that's basically what he did in
Empire Strikes Back will be proof of that.
Which is, one of the best as I'm surprising no one by saying.
And then Disney has also proven that model can not work when you have someone get out of hand, like Rian Johnson.
Yeah, Disney's just made the wrong choice in every way because they let Rian Johnson do what he want, and then they brought in the very clever what's their faces, the guys that did Spider-Verse and 21 Jump Street and all these kinds of things. And,
they're Gilbert and Sullivan.
Lord and Miller.
Lord and Miller,
for these very clever hipster directors. Hipster is not a word that Jake likes very much, but
they are brilliant.
Yeah, and they're hip and
they're the ones who are behind the Lego movie, right?
What's that? Lego movie is a great movie.
Lego movie, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the Jump Street movies.
I didn't know they were behind Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, they're the
oh wow,
yeah, they're the visionaries behind that whole thing. So if you think
any of the really good, interesting kids movies,
the
Lego
good
movie was great.
Yeah, like
innovative in a way.
Yeah, and so is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, into a genre that had been
done to death, eaten over, picked over.
How many Spider-Man movies are there?
Right.
And they did something completely fresh and exciting and cool.
When you think about Lego Movie, the fact that they can make it work where you have that Will Ferrell scene at the end with the dad and the son.
Yeah.
They get real emotion out of it, but it doesn't seem corny and cheesy to be flipping between these worlds.
Well, it's really moving, and I think we're going to talk today a lot about the hero's journey, I'm sure. Lego Movie, far and away, the best deconstruction and the best sort of meta commentary on the whole hero's journey.
Yeah.
While still having a lot of sympathy, emotion, and sweetness to it.
Yeah,
which is like that. I mean, that is the line. I bet you're going to bring up Shrek.
I'm about to say Shrek. That's right.
Like
Think
Shrek's
about how
a great.
Shrek trashed fairy tales and just had a chip on its shoulder about Disney and everything.
It was angry.
Yeah.
It was angry, and these guys, they can deconstruct it without feeling angry.
Well, it's because
while feeling.
What ends up happening in those movies is it works very much like a metaphor, like a poetic metaphor, because what the movies end up being about is a son dealing with what it means to be a hero through his father as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the second one worked because it was about a boy having to then learn how to relate to his sister.
So yeah, you bring in these geniuses for Solo, and they're perfect. Mm-hmm. They are the perfect guys to choose for a Han Solo movie.
Right.
There's not a better decision you could have made than to take Lord and Miller and give them Han Solo. A Han Solo franchise is what they were actually given.
Right.
And then they did something just a little too creative and a little too unique and a little too whatever, and we'll never know.
Well, Hollywood is very risk averse, and that is partly George Lucas's fault, as we'll talk about. Hollywood is also
We should complete the story because people won't know. Lord and Miller got fired from Solo.
From Solo,
and they brought in Ron Howard, who is the single most vanilla,
the most pedestrian director of all time.
Director that you could ever want, and he's good at what he does, but what he's gonna give you is vanilla, and so you got a vanilla movie that some people really love and some people really hate. And
I liked it at the time, but the more I think about it, the more it does seem a crime that they made a Han Solo movie that's just kind of that boring. Like, there's just nothing very inspiring about it, and that in and of itself is almost more annoying than the Rian Johnson movie. I don't know. Yeah,
and people are going to blame Alden Ehrenreich and all kinds of other things. Alden Ehrenreich was not the problem with that movie.
No, the problem with that movie was the movie. It was
Ron Howard.
It was
the Disney machine. I don't even blame Ron Howard. Ron Howard came in,
did what he was told.
Did what he was told to do with the scraps of what was there.
But the fact that Ron Howard's that kind of director that can just be told what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
He's become, that's what he does with the Da Vinci Code movies.
Right.
He had a chance to be something different.
Apollo 13.
Apollo 13 was his last good movie, I think.
Well, I feel like this might be a good transition into a little history and context of Star Wars because it's an interesting thing. Let me take you guys back to a time, the 1970s, when Hollywood was not as risk averse, and the death of risk in Hollywood was basically Star Wars. But it's a really interesting time, the 70s going into the 80s, because the 70s was the boom of big studio creativity. You had the French Connection, you had The Godfather, you had all these classic films, even the big money makers, things like The Exorcist, really popular movie, also a really risky, brutal movie about a little kid becoming a cursing demon possessed.
But directors were moving in. The directors were more auteurs at that point, right?
Yeah, that auteur theory was actually a thing that people talked about, which if you don't know what that is, that's just the idea that there's this creative voice behind a film, and it's one guy, an auteur. So like Spielberg is the auteur of Spielberg movies, and if you look at Spielberg movies, you can see common themes and common ways of doing things. But it was a really exciting time for experimentation, and for the ratings code had kind of died in the 50s and 60s. So suddenly you could do, I'm not saying this is good, but I'm just saying this is how it was. Suddenly you could do sex and you could do violence in a way that not every movie had to be a family movie. The ratings code, and it was run by these Catholic people, and it was really restrictive. There were rules in the 40s, like if a woman was on a bed, a man could not be in the same bed. He had to have 1 foot on the ground. If they were going to do a scene where like he's sitting on the bed, he could not lift his feet. They had all these ridiculous rules. So you watch an old sitcom and everybody likes to make fun of it now, but you have like Lucy and Ricky will be in separate beds. Like we can't even acknowledge that married couples might share a bed.
Yeah.
But it would often be auteurs who would get that sort of freedom, right? I saw something the other day. about how Hitchcock was one of the first to be allowed to show a toilet flushing in Psycho.
Psycho begins with the toilet flushing, and it's a really famous, like, groundbreaking thing.
Got that freedom because he was Hitchcock.
Well, it's the same way that, look, Hollywood's always a business, and people just need to know that. And if you're a successful person, you're going to have more latitude than if you're not. I mean, Spielberg can bend the ratings to his will, things like Gremlins or Temple of Doom. You know, why didn't Raiders of the Lost Ark get an R instead of a PG? Well, Spielberg's a really popular guy that was bringing in money at the time.
Which I think this is a quick aside.
Right.
I think that's an interesting point at which you can show that art does affect morality.
Right.
Because when people like that get that freedom, it then presses boundaries that people thought were immoral.
Right.
Or at least immodest. Mm-hmm. And so I think movies really expose that for us. And books have done the same thing.
Right.
But I don't think books ever had the platform that movies have had, whether people like that or not.
Yeah, no, I think a movie can reach a lot of people really quickly in a way that even a best-selling book.
But that's because we do have to be careful. You have to be careful about the entertainment you take in.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it is trying to shape, for monetary purposes a lot of times, these sorts of things.
Well, what you see in the 70s with movies is everybody responding to the fact that they had this freedom. And it's a scary thing. It's a really scary thing. And I think you see that reflected in the movies. It's scary to be unchained and to be morally able to go where you want to go. And so maybe the big example from the 70s is The Exorcist. And it's a movie about a little girl that gets possessed by a demon. And it really tapped in. It was a really popular movie, I think, not just because of the gory special effects, but because it really tapped into this fear that older people had about where younger people were going. Are our kids just possessed by demons? I mean, that's the subtext. It's not even subtext. That's the text. Are our kids possessed by demons? It's in fact the text of The Exorcist. And so you have these really scary themes and people dealing, The Godfather is about a man who has a choice between being good and evil. And what does he choose, Brandon?
He chooses an orange and a heart attack.
He chooses an orange and a heart attack, but then his son chooses to be evil. And so you have these movies dealing with these heady things, being experimental. And then somebody named George Lucas had the idea, and it was an explicit idea that came to him, to just do something fun. And he thought, hey, you know what I really liked as a kid? I liked Flash Gordon serials. And so I'm going to see if I can get the rights to that. Flash Gordon was a comic book character who was dashing and, it was space opera. Basically, it was proto-Star Wars. Mm-hmm. That's how we think of it now, but Star Wars is post-Flash Gordon, actually. And so George Lucas just thought, I'm going to get the rights to this. And he couldn't. So he decided to write his own little space adventure. What?
That just makes me laugh.
What?
It'd be like if Tolkien was trying to get the rights to write a Thor book and he couldn't, so he came up with the Lord of the Rings.
Came up with the Lord of the Rings. That's a really good analogy, actually, because everybody knew Flash Gordon, and then George Lucas just made up these dumb names. I think Luke Skywalker's name was like something Star Killer. First draft was called The Rise of the Wills. And he just came up with this stuff, and he would write down little nonsense words and come back to them and cross some out and say, well, Obi-Wan, what? And it all seems so natural now. But you have to imagine a guy just, and a very mechanical engineer. This isn't Tolkien, looking up old manuscripts and adapting like these languages and drawing. This is a dude just making up nonsense.
Yep.
And seeing what of it sticks and what he wants to come back to. And we went through draft and got to deal with 20th Century Fox. I think because that they were not risk averse at the time, because they believed in auteurs, they believed in these people that were successful and exciting, these young men. And George Lucas was one of them. He was considered an outsider, kind of weird young genius. And so what George Lucas actually said about Star Wars is 20th Century Fox didn't bet on Star Wars, they bet on me. They didn't understand it. A bunch of studios turned it down. But what Alan Ladd, who ran 20th Century Fox at the time, what he said was, I trust you, George. You want to try something? And they gave him a small budget. I think it was like $8 million or something, which would buy you a decent amount. That's like a mid-sized budget. And they went over. I think the final amount for Star Wars was like $11 million or something like that. George Lucas had to start a special effects company, ILM. If you've ever seen them, they are special effects these days. They work on all the big movies. He had to start that company. He had to build everything from scratch. They had to create all these techniques to bring this world to life. And they did. And it was a huge success. And it changed everything. Star Wars made $1 $1,604,857,600. That's $1,604,000,000. That is the domestic gross adjusted for inflation of the various re-releases. Like, that's all the money that the original Star Wars movie has made over the years.
That's a lot.
Put together. That's a lot of money. In 2015, Star Wars made $700 million from toys alone.
What year?
Just in 2015.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
We're going to talk a lot about why Star Wars caught on and what it was able and why it did this. But let me just talk about what it created, because everything that we're going to talk about on this podcast is downwind from Star Wars. So you have to understand that even if you're not a big Star Wars person, guy or gal, you don't realize how much of your movie going diet, maybe if you don't know Hollywood history, you don't realize how much of your movie going diet, what you see, your Avengers movies, it all flows out of Star Wars, right? So the whole idea of the summer blockbuster season, the whole idea that Hollywood would basically throw all of its money and all of its time and all of its talent into creating these tentpole films comes from two gentlemen, Mr. Steven Spielberg and Mr. George Lucas. And Steven Spielberg released Jaws, which was a big, pulpy, exciting, scary shark movie. And then Lucas created Star Wars. And what you have to realize is that prestige Hollywood pictures were serious during the 70s and before that. So, like, the money would have been going into making things like The Godfather. And as things had started to become bifurcated between the prestige stuff and then the B movies, Roger Corman was a famous B movie producer of that era, and he created all these little horror movies based on Edgar Allan Poe. He also did pulpy space adventures and things like this, but no money went into that stuff. Monster movies, the 50s monster movies, you see the posters with the giant ants and stuff like that. These were generally not the movies that the money went into. They were silly things for kids that a slick producer could turn a profit on. A lot of times a really sleazy guy who was like an outsider even would, as to this day, you can still kind of break in. Horror movies is where this happens to this day because they're cheap to make. You just need prosthetics, and they're sold on concept, right? It's not a star thing. It's not a novel. The Godfather was a story that everybody was excited to see told because it was a very famous novel and it was a very prestigious thing to do. And so it was a property that everybody understood. But a giant bug movie sells itself not because it has a star, not because it has any kind of prestige, but because people want to see a giant bug.
Yep.
People want to see the attack of the 50-foot woman because there's a big bosomy woman on the poster and she's 50 feet. And that's what they're paying for. And this used to be the province of sleazy little producers that would churn out these cheap things. And the genius, what people have to understand, the genius of George Lucas was to say, what if we did this with all the prestige? What if we put the two together and we actually took seriously making a pulpy kids movie?
What if I took all of the B movies that I loved as a kid and put all of Hollywood into making what would have been really cool, what I wish it would have been for me as a kid.
Right, and that's always the way that pulp has been, is it basically, I mean, those producers, the sleazy cigar chopping producers of the 50s in Hollywood, the people that made these B movies and Z movies, they would have said, all you need is a poster. Like the poster was what sold the movie. So the poster would have a bosomy woman being carried off by a monster, and little kids will pay to see, teenage boys especially, will pay to see a bosomy woman carried off by a monster. But the problem is, the monster sucks and the woman's not that beautiful and it's not that interesting. So you're paying for a concept, but you're actually gypping people because you can't afford, you don't have the resources to actually give them what's promised. It's a bait and switch, right? And so the genius of George Lucas and Spielberg is to say, what if we gave them the bait and then we didn't do a switch? Like, what if we actually gave them a space opera? What if we actually gave them an adventure movie? James Bond movies even are pretty slow and they have one or two set pieces. But when you sell a James Bond movie, you say it's the most exciting, sexy thing. Well, what if we actually made something that was that exciting and that sexy, right? Like, what if we actually had something that was wall-to-wall adventure? James Bond promises wall-to-wall adventure. Let's actually do a movie that's just wall-to-wall adventure.
And so modern Hollywood was born.
Star Wars, 1977, arguably, is the birth of modern Hollywood. And everything you like about it, everything you hate about it, was born. You don't have Avengers without it. You don't have any of this stuff.
Avengers is really just the same concept. What if all of my favorite comic book characters, or that I had on all of my different cartoon shows that were terrible, or all those dumb little movies that never, what if we could pull them all together?
Right.
all at once and have them all on the big screen and put real money behind it.
Well, and what you have to understand, a lot of people in Hollywood and a lot of people in general don't like this because it wiped out actually two industries. Number one, it wiped out the B-movie producers. Like, suddenly B movies became the A movies, and so there wasn't a lot, except for horror. Horror has kind of, you can still do a cheap horror movie and sell it on the concept, but you can't really do a cheap space adventure anymore because people actually expect that that's where the resources, that's where the stars, that's where the machine actually exists to make space opera, to make stuff for kids, stuff for teenagers, to get money. What they discovered is a very simple business equation. Who has expendable income and who wants to go to see a movie again and again and again? It's not adults. It's not 40-year-old women. It's not people that have read The Godfather. Yeah. No, it's just kids. Like, kids will, when I was a kid, same thing. When I was a teenager and I had a lot of expendable income, I would see, in my day, it would have been Gladiator. I think I saw that thing like 5 or 6 times. And we had like a second run theater in town where you could see it for cheap.
It was always the $5 theater,
yeah, it was just
right?
well, we got a little extra time today.
Yeah, it was like, absolutely. You go see first run movies at the nice theater, but then, on a Tuesday afternoon on a, 100-degree day, what's playing at the $5 theater? Is
cool.
Question. They're playing Independence Day again. I think, that hasn't been in theaters for a couple of months or a year.
Right.
But who cares? Like, it's Independence Day. Let's go see it, or whatever it was.
Lord of the Rings would have been that same time for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
2000.
And I saw those movies a lot.
Yeah, I saw them too many times.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even really like them that much. I liked them okay, but I just saw them because that's like what we did to hang out. There's a lot of movies, like there's weird like Ashley Judd movies or something that I just saw at the time because that's
what else are you going to do?
What else are you going to do, Brandon?
I don't know.
It's air conditioned and it's a nice thing to do on a summer day.
We hung out at this pool a lot.
Well, that is something else you can do, but
we did that too.
Yeah.
Biked all over the place and had our own Spielbergian adventures and Sandlot baseball and all that sort of thing. But
I just watched movies, guys.
Also,
I didn't grow up in a community where we could do Sandlot baseball that easily.
I wasn't far from ball fields where I grew up, and it wasn't really a Sandlot. It was just like actual,
just baseball.
The baseball.
Well, that actually
fields.
that is the competition. Actually, is sports. And it's not just playing sports, but organized sports. Godzilla, the King of the Monsters, just hit this weekend. And what was there? There was a big soccer thing, right?
Yeah, the Champions League final was on Saturday, and the NBA finals were on.
Now, that cost Godzilla millions and millions of dollars. Godzilla is a movie that's designed for the international market. Guess who? What else the international market loves?
Soccer.
And so people stayed in to watch soccer.
It was the biggest soccer match of the year. So
right, and that really hurt people that otherwise would have been like, let's go. Unfortunately, Godzilla wasn't a critical it wasn't the kind of movie that you just had to see because it didn't turn out to be that good, I guess, or the scuttlebutt wasn't that it was that great. And so if you were kind of on the fence, you watched soccer instead. This weekend. So that the B movie industry got wiped out because suddenly B movies became A movies, and that's basically where we live today. Everything that is kind of silly and for kids is what drives the industry. The other thing that by and large got wiped out was not the prestige picture like The Godfather, because you still will get a couple of big Oscar contending movies that will be advertised and that the studios will put money into. But the mid-level, quirky, interesting kind of movie has basically died, and it held on for years.
It's actually done.
Well, yeah, it's migrated to Netflix.
Exactly.
And just into the small screen, but you don't get a run of something like that. I'm trying to think of what an example of this would be. Well, just even the romantic comedies. Like the romantic comedies, I don't watch a lot of romantic comedies, but the ones that I've heard people talk about have all hit Netflix.
Yeah. It was just this past weekend. There's Mariah Carey, Always Be My Maybe.
Yeah,
was trending all over Twitter. I was like, "Always Be My Maybe." What is that?
Right.
Oh, it's a new rom-com that has dropped on Netflix. Never heard of it, but it's something that everybody's suddenly excited about because Netflix popped it in at the top, and people went into Net. And some people had been anticipating it, but
right.
Yeah.
But that's where word of mouth type things will happen.
Yeah.
The thing is, it's gotten so expensive, though, to perpetuate this system of these big special effects, the B movies that have become A movies. They cost a lot to make. And so it's kind of curtailed creativity. You could at least argue that if you're going to spend $200 million plus, and that's just to make the movie, you're going to spend another $100 or $200 million to advertise the movie. You want it to be a surefire thing. And so what do? You rely on intellectual property that people know. You rely on concepts that have already worked. You don't take a lot of risk. Now, I think that there are interesting things you can do within that, the Marvel movies being the primary example of people that have had something of a creative vision that they've been able to bring to these surefire intellectual properties. But what you don't see a lot of is a thing you've never heard of, a new idea. I think the last one that really took hold of the zeitgeist, I mean, every once in a while you get a Hunger Games or something like that, but even that's based on a book, something that's already had some success in a lower stakes field. The last really big one that I can think of that just hit and took the world by storm was The Matrix, just a new idea, and that was now about 20 years ago.
What about John Wick?
Well, John Wick started out as a very small concept.
John Wick's only become big.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. There's not a lot of those. I mean,
it probably wasn't designed for sequels either.
Yeah,
no, it's just as a happy circumstance that it.
John Wick, the original, is a very low budget kind of affair that Keanu Reeves wasn't in any great demand. His salary wouldn't have been that big. Yeah, so you can still make something like that, but the fact that there's been 3 of them, the fact that it's been turned into a franchise, actually, John Wick is even actually kind of unusual.
The kinds of things that you might think fit in this category, like Mission Impossible, that's a really old IP.
Well, yeah, and it's based on a TV show, and I mean, they will do anything, any identifiable.
That's what I mean. It goes back to the 90s with Tom Cruise's heyday, but it was a TV show before that. It was
right.
Like
in the 90s gave us all these weird things like the Brady Bunch movie, the Beverly Hillbillies movie. They were actually weirdly, The Saint with Val Kilmer, they were mining 50s and 60s TV. And what they quickly found is that kids of today actually don't care about the Beverly Hillbillies. Those things didn't make a lot of money, but they will desperately do anything to kind of like, it's recognizable. Somebody might pay for this based on, let's do Get Smart with Steve Carell. People might remember that.
Yeah.
And we directly, not indirectly, we directly have Star Wars to thank for giving us that kind of an industry. So if you wish that there was a little bit more experimentation, because if you go back and you look at what was happening in the 70s with things like The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, we never did an episode on it, but the 3 of us watched Apocalypse Now together, which, say what you will about that movie, it's risky, it's interesting, it's a crazy gamble of a movie.
It's creative.
Vietnam as seen through Heart of Darkness. I mean, that's just like, who comes up with that stuff? That would never get bankrolled today. They don't take those kinds of risks. I mean, the millions of dollars that were spent to make a giant, big movie like that was, you just wouldn't do that today. You wouldn't take that kind of a risk.
But what's interesting is this all started because someone took a huge risk, which is Star Wars.
Exactly, and that's the sad part of it for me is I don't just want to see the new guy play in the sandbox of Star Wars. I want to see somebody create the next Star Wars. I want somebody to reconfigure the elements that I love into something that looks and feels new. But you don't get a lot of opportunity to do that.
Except in the podcast world.
We
have Sanityville.
In the Wizarding world.
And the Wizarding
world, yes. She did create something pretty new there.
Yeah.
That might be the better example.
But she did it first in a book, and a book doesn't cost the overhead of a book and books are dying too, actually.
That's sad.
The Blockbuster mentality is definitely in the book world as well.
Yes, it is.
With Amazon making it so impossible for anyone to make any kind of money off of the book. Really, people are just looking for your J.K. Rowlings, and they are relying on brands like Jack Reacher, like Danielle Steele, like whatever it is. I don't know what it is. I'm not up with the supermarket bestsellers. Stephen King would still be one.
Which is why all your major authors who are doing any serious work also have to have side gigs, like a professor's or something. So anyone, like I think Zoe, what's her name? Who wrote White Teeth?
Oh, Smith?
Zoe, something like that. I think that's right. Zadie Smith.
Zadie Smith, yeah.
There we go. We got it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure she teaches. They all have like guest MFA professorships, or they just have their PhD, like B.H. Fairchild, who I've mentioned before. He just was a traveling professor who also just happened to be a National Critics Book Circle poet.
Right.
So that's the way that they make their living now.
Yeah, well, I think even that mentality we can probably somehow blame on Star Wars. That whole Blockbuster idea of we're going to put all our money into a surefire thing, and then we're going to advertise the crap out of it, and we're going to just get people. I mean, it's as old as showmanship, right? It's just become writ large thanks to the way these properties have developed.
And it's really helped increase that divide we talk a lot about on the Bookening, where, I'm going to mention it again, modernism created this one vein of art that's now we all think of as belonging to the Academy.
Right.
And so even like high movies like the Coen brothers and Who else would you? P.T. Anderson, those guys who are complete opposite of Star Wars.
Right.
They kind of belong to the university people.
Yeah, well,
that crowd, the intellectual crowd. And then you have over here with the Marvel movies and stuff, that belongs to the other crowd.
That makes me really sad, too. The idea of a movie for everyone, you know, I mean, you could argue that Avengers is for everyone, but it's really kind of bifurcated between the high art and the low commercial stuff these days. And I think that's too bad. You go back to the 1930s or 1940s, you see a movie like The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn, which has a love story. It's got great action. It's got witty dialogue. It's intentionally designed so that dad can enjoy it, mom can enjoy it, little boy can enjoy the sword fight, little girl can enjoy the kiss. It's like designed with that mentality of this needs to be clean and fun and for everyone. And I guess you could say that Star Wars kind of has that model to it, but it doesn't have a lot for someone that's looking for any kind of intellectual stimulation. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying I miss the fact that a movie actually could be a full meal. And now it's either dessert or it's Brussels sprouts, and there's not really a lot of in between. So Star Wars has made $1 billion, adjusted for inflation, one of the most popular movies ever made. Probably the most important movie of the 20th century. The most important movie of the 20th century would be that movie where the train comes at the thing because it was the first movie. But it's a young medium. But certainly one of the most important movies of the second half of the 20th century, let's say, one that directly affected how we watch and how we process and what kind of movies are given us today. Why did this do this? That's my question for you, gentlemen. Why is this movie so beloved, given the fact that it kind of sucks? Well, let's do this. Let's talk about so we've all watched Star Wars in preparation, A New Hope in preparation for this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what our experience was, and then let's talk about the movie in general and why we think it works or doesn't work. So, what was your experience watching Star Wars this time, gentlemen?
I sat down and watched it with my kids. It was fun. It was fun watching them react to it, and it was fun realizing again how effective of a kids movie it actually is. Mm-hmm. Which, you know, if you approach it as an adult thinking you're going to have the same kind of experience that you had as a kid, or you're going to love it as much, you're going to be very disappointed. If you watch it through the lens of kids as a kids movie, then it's pretty great. And so just sitting down with my kids, watching them be super engaged with it was fun. And I wrote down a couple of moments that sort of illustrate how well it worked, I guess. So you have like these little dorky moments all throughout the film that just seem kind of clunky and silly, right? Like, oh, she's going to hide the plans in the pod and shoot off the pod. Oh, the guys are going to be like, oh, it's just an empty escape pod being sent to this planet. Probably it's no big deal. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to come back to Vader a little bit later and be like, well, we can't find the plans anywhere on the ship, but there was this escape pod that was launched. And Vader says, she must have hidden the plans in the pod. and you know, you think of that as just being really stupid. One of my kids was just like, wow, Darth Vader is really smart. By the way, he figured it out. He solved the problem.
I have a question. Is it a plot hole? Why didn't they just blow up that ship?
It's just a plot hole. It's stupid. They would have just, like, Star Wars as it is now, they would have just blown it up because it was there and it was leaving the thing. They would have just shot it. They have a Star Destroyer. There's no reason they can't just...
I guess when you watch the movie in isolation, it's like, well, we don't exactly know what the rules of engagement are here and what happens in this universe. And there might be we can just assume there's factors, kind of all the stuff about the diplomatic mission and how much of a train wreck it would be for the Empire if they actually killed Princess Leia and all this kind of stuff, which doesn't make a lot of sense based on how Rogue One ended.
No.
Diplomatic mission to Alderaan. No. That was dumb. I like Rogue One. We'll get to Rogue One, but Rogue One actually, in some ways, does enormous favors to this movie, but in other ways, it just makes it make even less sense, I'd say.
It makes it have some tongue-in-cheek tension that wasn't there to begin with.
Yes, but it
makes it feel actually more, in some ways, dramatic.
Yeah, no, it makes it more poignant, but it also makes it make no sense, I think. I don't know. We'll talk about it when we get to Rogue One, maybe. But what else did your kids have to say about this movie?
You know, as a kid, you latch on to R2-D2 and C-3PO. And so my kids, just watching them love those characters. And there's that moment pretty early on where Luke walks away or whatever, and R2-D2 bleep bloops, and C-3PO says, "No, I don't think he likes you, and I don't like you either."
Boo.
Yeah. Boop, boop. Mm-hmm. Whatever it was. And, one of my oldest daughter was just like, "Aw." One of my sons jumped up and he said, "Hey, I like you. In fact, I love you." And that was pretty funny.
That was pretty cute.
Pretty cute, yeah. So just seeing them really engage with the movie on that level. And I don't know, there's a couple of dumb little examples early on, but I was watching for that. And so that's why I wrote it down. But yeah.
Brennan, same questions?
Yeah, I mean, I had fun watching it, and my kids enjoy this. And it's fun watching it with your kids. I don't have any special stories to tell about it because I didn't write anything down like that. Or I don't think there was anything that really stuck out to me that way. But general impression is it's fun. It's harmless. Mm-hmm. It's not great.
Right.
the dialogue is pretty bad.
Yeah.
But the kids enjoy it. And I think one of the best parts of it, as far as the kids are involved, is are the minor characters, but they really get attached to them, like Chewbacca.
Yep.
Or R2-D2. Or C-3PO to an extent. Mm-hmm. But even like the little Jawas, is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Those creatures at the beginning. Like Lucy's fascinated by those things. Mm-hmm. And I remember being scared of them as a kid.
I was fascinated by how clunky their special effects are. Their little mechanical eyes inside their suits are pretty obvious.
Yeah, they just look like little flashlights.
That's HD. That's Blu-ray not doing the movie any favors, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, overall, pretty similar experience. It's fun watching these movies with your kids. But as an adult, it doesn't do a whole lot for you.
Yeah, well, I watched it with my fiancée, and she kind of remembered Star Wars. It was interesting because she didn't think she remembered anything about Star Wars. She really couldn't remember the last time she'd seen the movies. It was interesting what she got right and what she got wrong. There's a lot of it that had just soaked into it, whether she'd even ever seen the movie or not. There's a lot of it she just knew because it's so ubiquitous.
Yeah.
When Obi-Wan showed up, she said, "Oh man, I thought he was way younger," because she was picturing Han Solo.
Yeah.
So that was a mistake. Which I dare say most people wouldn't make. She expected a hot young guy, but it was not. It was an old man. She said two other things of note. It's just interesting.
Was she expecting Han Solo, or was she expecting Ewan McGregor?
I asked her about that, and she kind of made it sound like maybe she was expecting Ewan McGregor. But then when the real Han Solo showed up, she was like, "Oh, that's the guy." So
Gotcha.
Yeah, she thought Obi-Wan was the young dashing rogue. The other two things, when we got to Obi-Wan's apartment and they were hanging out and Obi-Wan was talking about the Force and all that kind of stuff, she was like, "Man, shouldn't this have been like a half an hour longer?" She just felt like it was going by and hitting these plot points really quick, which was the opposite of experience that I was having, because I was just like, man, this movie, I forgot how much time it just spends on world building and, hey, that's a cute robot. But for her, it was like, I'm supposed to accept all these characters just because the movie told me, like, come on, like, let me spend some time with them. Which I should say, is interesting because all that stuff's on the cutting room floor. There was tons of material about Luke's life on Tatooine and him watching a big space battle, him actually watching the space battle in the sky, like with Biggs just like looking up, which actually sounds like kind of a cool scene.
Yeah.
It all hit the cutting room floor. George Lucas thought it was too complicated, and he said, let's actually make this the droid story and follow them and just let them be the through line and then they can like trade the ball off to Luke. But if we try to do too many things at once, it's just going to be complicated. Huh. So he did that, and I guess it was the right choice. The movie certainly seems to have done okay for itself. Third thing, my fiance felt really bad for Darth Vader.
That's interesting.
It was interesting. She really latched onto the idea of Darth Vader as outsider, and she really, like, the fact that none of the other Imperial dudes took his religion seriously, she was like, I guess I can say she just came from a situation at school, she just graduated, where a bunch of people didn't take her religion and the fact that she wanted to, like, marry me instead of get a PhD seriously. So maybe that's why, maybe she felt a little bit like a black robot monster.
Which explains why she's started to wear a black cape. And
right, yeah.
A breathing machine now.
She did also get all of her limbs chopped off and then burnt up in lava. So
on purpose, which was weird.
Yeah, that was not something I generally recommend. But she was just like, "Aw, Darth Vader, nobody takes him seriously."
Yeah, choke that guy out.
Choke that guy out. Yeah, exactly.
He deserves it.
Well, and I actually responded to that too. I really liked the idea of Darth Vader as someone who's
an outsider. Absolutely,
a weird, like, I think.
He's a relic.
I almost want to even say the movie's lost something when they just made him the supreme commander of all evil in the next I mean, obviously he has to be a very potent figure for the films to work, but I kind of like the idea that the Empire is this big bureaucratic machine that perpetuates itself and is doing just fine. And then you have this weird psychopath robot guy, man, who believes in this outdated religion. It's kind of a like Rasputin in the, what's the dynasty?
That's interesting. The Romanov.
In the Romanov dynasty, somebody that certain people take very seriously, and they should, but also not so much. I like that idea.
Well, it's interesting because I used to really sympathize as a boy with Darth Vader a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my granddad used to.
Yeah, I think you got to tell the story.
Oh, I mean, yeah, we would be driving a lot, so I loved my granddad. This was my dad's dad. He's the guy I would watch like work in his wood shop a lot, and he was just a man. And we'd drive in his old orange beat-up pickup truck to go to the store or something. And when we would go, he'd do two things. One, he would always pretend like he forgot who I was, which just drove me crazy. And then two, he would like start talking to me about things I liked. And one thing he liked to talk about was Darth Vader, and he would call him the Dark Tomato. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, "No, Granddad, it's Darth Vader." And he'd be like, "You mean no Dark Tomato?" But I felt like he was picking on Darth Vader.
Right.
Like Darth Vader deserves some respect. And I wonder if it didn't have to do with that mentality that Darth Vader is kind of an outsider. And for a kid, kids like monsters. Mm-hmm. But there's something about Darth Vader that has clicked in a way that other monsters haven't.
Yeah.
I think even in a way that Voldemort doesn't quite work.
Yeah. Well, Voldemort is such an adult kind of a figure. Like, I don't think kids sympathize with Emperor Palpatine all that much. But when somebody like Frankenstein, kids tend to sympathize with Frankenstein. I think boys especially, they like have these bodies that they can't really control very easily. And so like they accidentally punch out their sister or something and they get in trouble. And so when they see a big hulking kind of a monster character that's capable of destruction, I think little boys just love those kinds of characters.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that's just my theory off the top of my head.
And with Darth Vader, I mean, it works for the movie because the Force is slowly becoming more important again.
Right.
And so it would make sense for him not to be essential at the beginning.
Right.
But as the importance of the Force, and actually the way the Force has been running the Empire the whole time anyways, becomes more apparent, then he also has his ascension.
Right.
So I think it just matches the way the movies work too.
Yeah, it actually works
even
really
if it's incidental.
Yeah.
Which it probably was slightly incidental.
Well, the question of how much is incidental and how much is not in these movies is an interesting one that I don't suppose we'll get too much into today. But George Lucas likes to, in retrospect, claim that everything was on purpose. And I'd say there's a decent amount of evidence to the contrary.
Yep.
But I can understand why that's the story that he wants to tell. Guys, let's talk about what makes this movie so potent. Why do kids still love this movie? I didn't care about this movie at all watching it this time. I thought it was kind of boring. I'm sorry if that's sacrilege to some of our listeners, but I don't know. I kind of think like kids' movies are for kids, and that's okay. Like, it's okay that there was something that was really great that I loved. And, it's like eating something. I've digested it now. Like, it gave me so much, and I just let it go. Let it go, Luke. I think there's really something to be said for finding new things and letting go of old things. I don't know. I know there's going to be people that hear me say the movie didn't do much for me, and they will actually be angry about that. They will be offended by that because it's Star Wars. It's great. You're just a snob. It's like, no, the movie did wonderful things. It fueled my imagination during my childhood, and now I'm not a kid anymore. I put away childish things. Anyway, I'm not doing anything to make my anti-snob case, am I? But I hate Star Wars. I hate fun. And if you're a listener, I hate you.
And that's why we're doing this podcast.
That's why we're doing this podcast. No, I love it, but it's just not for me. The dialogue's simplistic. I like witty dialogue. I like interesting characters. This movie doesn't have those things. It has other things that are just as important and wonderful, and we're about to talk about those. They just aren't so much the things that I look for in movies anymore. But why does this movie work?
Hero's Journey, that's why.
Hero's Journey, Jake. What's that?
Well, let me back up two things. Hero's Journey and Wild Context.
Mm-hmm.
So Hero's Journey is the idea that, for those of you that don't know, the idea that there's one big story that we tell, and we tell it over and over and over and over again. And a guy named Joseph Campbell thought he could distill it, and it's based on Jungian psychology and a whole bunch of crap. But it's basically the story of an outsider who gets drawn into adventure, kills the dragon and gets the girl, and comes back a changed person with something for everybody.
Yep.
And I mean, that's a really simplistic view of it, but it's just...
I mean, if you really don't know, just think The Matrix. He's a dude. He's kind of an outsider. He suddenly gets swept up into a big adventure.
He has a choice to make.
He makes a choice whether he's going to move forward or go back into his dream world. He decides to be a hero, and then he gets trained by his mentor, and then he fights the villain, and then in a absolutely unmotivated, hilariously sexist twist at the end of The Matrix, he gets the girl for absolutely no reason except for that's how heroes' journeys work, and that's why it actually works in the movie. You accept it, people.
Yeah, you just accept it because these are the stories that we tell,
even though they've done no work.
And the whole idea is that we need these stories because they help us make sense of our own lives and the journeys of our own lives, and so they resonate. And so George Lucas read Joseph Campbell.
Literally read Joseph Campbell's book.
And said, I'm going to follow this point by point by point. I'm just going to take this template. I'm going to follow it point by point by point. I'm going to have characters, and these characters are going to be, I don't know how intentional he was about this, but they're basically going to be really flat avatars for you so that you can just simply project yourself onto them. They're going to be flat screens.
We've talked about this a million times on our podcast, The Bookening. If Luke Skywalker was a more complex character, he'd be a less effective character because it's not about him. It is, for me as a viewer, actually, I want him to be more complex, but that's my problem, actually, because if little boys are going to put themselves in his shoes, he needs to actually be as flat and two-dimensional as possible.
So that they can imagine themselves as Luke Skywalker.
Right.
Luke Skywalker is easy to translate as them.
And oftentimes, like Frodo Baggins is the most boring character in Lord of the Rings. Neo is a complete cipher in The Matrix. You think about these kinds of stories. The hero, the eponymous
part of the
hero.
point is the hero exists for you to be, to put yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
Your imagination actually fills out the quirks because it's you. You imagine yourself in his position surrounded by cool, colorful sidekicks and characters like Han Solo and R2-D2 and Chewbacca. And so you take this sort of very basic, elemental, fundamental, deeply resonant idea, and then you set it in this amazing world where you have alien landscapes and binary sunsets and creatures all over the place that are just different and colorful and fun. And the idea of the Force, this thing that you can tap into that's deep down inside of you, and if you just could tap into it, you can become exceptional. You can manipulate people's minds. You can control your surroundings. You can make the one shot that is a 1 in a million shot. Eventually, you can move things with your mind and all kinds of cool stuff. Like you have access to superpowers.
Yep.
That are just beneath the surface if you can just let go and reach out with your feelings. Right? Super simplistic stuff, but, it's really... So he did a killer job of world building and creating a context that set everything off in stark relief.
But that setting, what you're talking about there, the otherworldliness to it, is very essential to this process working. So if you think about... You've made the point, I'm not sure you made it yet, but this is a good point.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about this maybe in another podcast or something. Star Wars isn't really sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Star Wars is a fantasy.
It's fantasy, yeah.
And that's important because fantasy works differently than sci-fi. One of the reasons Game of Thrones is popular is because it has that gritty realism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really not fantasy. It's like trying to be some kind of historical fantasy. And I have real issues with Game of Thrones and people who claim they like Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
But that's an aside. If you look at the things that really work well, Lord of the Rings, even Narnia, and the things that Lewis would build, Star Wars, even Beowulf to an extent. Mm-hmm. They deal with these worlds that don't quite feel like our world. And it's because if they feel like our world, then we want them to look realistic because we know what our world works like. Like, why does Odysseus, when he meets all the gods, have to be away from his home? Well, it's because we know that when you're home, the home works a certain way.
Right.
Why does Harry Potter have to go to this remote place to actually have all the magic work? Well, it's because we know what the world works like and it looks like. It's Hogwarts, where Hogwarts has to feel separate. That's because these sorts of stories deal with things that feel otherworldly. Other people might call them transcendental.
Right.
But what the real word is archetypes. They're these big notions, these big things that connect us to huge categories, and that's all that archetypes mean. It's myth-making. Mm-hmm. And myths deal in these huge concepts that all cultures share in common. And so that's what the hero's journey draws from, are these huge concepts that all cultures do share in common, like good and evil, like the hero, the concept of a hero. I mean, there's a reason that Beowulf and what's the famous Assyrian one?
Oh, what is his name? Starts with an M.
We should know. We're just both.
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh. Thank you. Not an M, but has an M in it. Isn't it funny whenever you're put on the spot, you can never remember?
Yeah, you can never.
But yeah, so Gilgamesh, all these big stories, Odysseus, right? They all deal with the hero, and that's because every culture is thinking about heroes and what it means to be a hero. They're thinking about good and evil, relationships between people, fathers and sons. They're thinking about these, and that's what Joseph Campbell was talking about. He thinks it's a subconscious thing that connects us all, but it's because, and I think we're going to talk about this later, so I don't want to get there to the answer.
Sorry.
Right? But there is a reason that this is true, and it is Christian in its origin, and we'll get there, I'm sure, right? But that's why these movies are successful, is because Lucas drew on these huge concepts, these categories that we all, the mentor, good and evil. You see that obviously with Darth Vader,
right?
In his clothes, the outfit that they chose to put him in.
He looks bad.
But the Empire itself is very bad, and it's very stereotypically bad. They blow up a whole planet.
Right.
So J.J. Abrams had to one-up that by blowing up how many planets?
3 planets. What was it?
It's like, look at me. I can blow up 3 planets.
They all dress in black.
Yeah.
Yep.
The hallways are black. Everything is black unless it's red.
And
Lucas is nothing if not a baby boomer, so it's really drawing on some 20th century stuff that would have been really potent. That's maybe a little less potent for us these days, although it still very much lingers in our iconography.
Very Nazi.
But yeah, exactly. World War II is all over this movie.
Absolutely.
The dog fights,
the shape of the helmets.
In Vietnam.
Yeah, the whole end of the movie is just a World War II bomber movie, which Lucas would have grown up with.
And so, but that itself is there are these So one way of saying it, can we introduce this term?
Sure.
Would be the collective unconscious.
Yes.
And this is a Jungian term. It comes from Carl Jung, who was a disciple of Freud, who introduced the idea of the subconscious to every human draws from this, and it's a kind of a mystical idea.
It is completely a mystical idea.
And a lot of magic theory comes from this as well. But that we have this collective pool of unconsciousness that we draw from that then affects the way we think and look at the world.
Right.
And that it's kind of like Plato's forums as well. I mean, you've had these ideas throughout history. This isn't anything really all that new. It's just the way that we look at it. And so it would, according to Jung, it would explain why we have all these myths and all these different cultures that draw from these same sources and have these same mythologies that are all about heroes, about good and evil, about the journey, about mentors, about sidekicks and stuff like that. And they all have the same...
Fathers and sons.
Yeah, fathers and sons. They all draw from the same thing.
Well, let me just ask this question now. Do we agree with that, fellas? It certainly seems to have worked for George Lucas. He's made $1 billion. Certainly seems to work for a lot of people when they draw on these archetypes. And yet, collective unconscious, all this kind of stuff sounds a little mystical to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, on the one hand, it's garbage, but it is, on the other hand, tapping into something that's real, which is the way that God made the world and the story of the world as it's unfolding as God has ordered and designed it. So the reality is readjust the focal point a little bit and realize that the reality is that God designed the world and everything in it. And there is a story that has been in the process of unfolding over history, and we know what the story is, and everybody else has to have their own counterfeit of it.
Right. If
they're going to be a compelling substitute for God and for true religion, they need a compelling counterfeit, which means there are always going to be similarities. The best counterfeits are awfully close to the truth. But the real story is the story of mankind's fall from grace and God's judgment, and God sending his son to be the hero of the story.
Yeah. And he gave us a conscience. He's written it on everyone's heart, is the law, so that men really do know when they're breaking the law.
Right.
It's just our sin and rebellion that keeps us from repentance. And also he has given us the book of nature. And that's really what what Jung and Freud are talking about is the fact that we have metaphors, we have nature that we draw from, and we can see truth within nature in the way that the world works.
Well,
and it has to do with the stuff that's been made. It's part of creation that is written into that.
Well, and what somebody like Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero's Journey, would say is, your religion actually matches a lot of other things. Seems like actually you were drawing on the collective unconscious there when you came up with Jesus and all this stuff, because actually it's very similar to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And what we would say to that is precisely the opposite. Your myth making is, of course, similar to our truth, because when a truth defines the world, Chesterton famously wrote about this, when a truth defines the world that way, of course people are going to have all kinds of counterfeits, and of course it's going to be resonant for people. It just makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit more about the specific archetypes in this movie. So we have the hero. What kind of a hero is Luke Skywalker? Do we think he's an effective hero? What does it say about us that Luke Skywalker is one of our big heroes? I was surprised by what a brat he was in this movie.
Yeah.
My girlfriend, another thing she commented was, she just said, was he written to be played by an actor this age? Because he feels like a 9-year-old or something. Like you expect him to get sent to his room the way that he's...
Oh, yeah. I don't want to go to... What does he say?
But I was going to go to the Tashi station to get some power converters. You can waste time with your friends later.
No, I've never really... I mean, Luke has always been a problem for me with these movies. And I think we talked about that in our bookending episode on Star Wars. I do think he's whiny. I do think that he feels... he's not the hero that we would expect from other things.
Right.
He's not Beowulf.
No, he's not Beowulf, that's for sure.
He's not Odysseus, even though Odysseus does kind of whine sometimes too. But, and is he what was the other question? Is he the hero we deserve?
I don't know. I mean,
or what does it say about us?
What does it say about Luke that he would be the prototypical hero of our times? I don't know. Or what does it say about us?
Like, does it say anything about our effeminacy and our
I don't know that it does. I'm asking the question. You guys can answer it.
I mean, but there's a sense in which Frodo is also one of the whinier characters in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, but Frodo doesn't really undergo a transformation as a character. He's basically a pretty good guy who remains a pretty good guy, and his transformation is only to sort of be corrupted by the ring in a certain, but then not really.
And had Rian Johnson not ruined Luke and messed up so badly with him, I do think Luke does have an arc. He becomes, by the last movie, pretty awesome, right? He becomes a Jedi.
In a very Zen sort of a way.
And I mean,
it's almost more of an Eastern kind of a hero's journey. It's like a really petulant, silly boy becomes a samurai is basically what we're watching. More than like the young, awesome knight becomes an old, awesome, wise knight.
Yeah. Who still is young and immature and makes bad decisions, which is what Captain America could have been.
Right.
Yeah, maybe somebody say something about our culture that's the way we all want to end our stories. I can tell you that he bothers me in this movie, but I understand why they make him so bratty and petulant. I think they could have done it less. And I think that's just Luke. I mean, because Anakin has some of those issues in the other movies as well. I just think George Lucas likes to write his young, immature characters that way because I think he thinks that's the best way to show immaturity and youth.
Well, I don't mind a hero's journey where the hero has to go on a journey and has to learn things and grow and be disciplined. I keep thinking of Empire Strikes Back. All the stuff with Yoda to me as a kid was really painful because Luke kept messing up and doing the wrong thing and being lame and being stupid and being young, and it was very relatable. Like I have had that feeling with teachers and mentors where I'm just disappointing them and it sucks. And this one, when watching it again, it almost felt like he kind of got away with it, and I didn't like that as much as an adult, at least. Like he's a brat, and then it turns out that he's a brat that deserves to have superpowers and doesn't really need to learn anything about himself, and this just taking this first movie by itself.
Well, I think this is a question we're going to keep revisiting as the movies go.
Yeah.
So how does he develop Luke? I mean, we all agree that he's a brat in this movie, and then at the end he has superpowers. It's kind of like Harry Potter.
Right, exactly.
Except Harry Potter is a bit of a less of a brat.
Right. Well, okay. Same question about Obi-Wan Kenobi. Is he an effective mentor figure? Is he a good mentor? What does it say about our culture? What does it say about George Lucas? What does it say about the movie that Obi-Wan Kenobi is the mentor in this movie? I don't have a particular.
You don't have an answer.
I don't have the answer. I'm asking the question.
I mean, he gets very little screen time.
He says a couple of things about Force and about Luke's dad.
Yeah.
And he cuts off a guy's arm, and then he dies. So
are we saying he's just flat and boring, or?
I don't know. As a kid, I always thought he was pretty cool.
He's better than Dumbledore.
Okay.
That's there. There's a thought for you.
Why?
Because Dumbledore never tells Harry that he ever did anything wrong. And Obi-Wan says, it'll be enough, when Luke is whining about how his speeder didn't get enough money.
Yeah.
They're both liars.
They are both liars. That's right. He doesn't tell the truth about
anything.
Right.
Whether it was meant to be this way or not, the fact is now almost everything that Obi-Wan said to Luke was a lie.
Right.
Meant to help him grow, but withholding information because he's too young for it.
Well, where does that come from? There's a question. Where does the idea of the trickster mentor come from? Because Yoda does the same thing. Dumbledore's kind of the same way. Where does this concept even come from? I suppose it occurs in mythology. There are those.
I think it's pretty Eastern.
It is Eastern. It's also Merlin to some extent, who is himself not Eastern, but pagan in an Eastern sort of a way.
Yeah, but
well, very Celtic.
Mm-hmm.
Merlin's an interesting analogy and contrast because Merlin's not. I mean, I guess it depends on where you're looking.
Right.
But Merlin doesn't lie.
Right.
Merlin may withhold information, or Merlin may just sort of like Gandalf is more like Merlin.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Gandalf doesn't really necessarily lie.
He doesn't lie. He tells you what you need to know.
Yeah.
Well, Morphe, that just
for the moment.
The Oracle in the Matrix, they wrote her the same way, where she tells Neo the opposite of the truth so that he can be inspired to achieve or whatever. She tells him not just I omitted something, but she actually straight up lies.
Does she? I don't remember that.
She tells him he's not the chosen one.
Oh, yeah.
And then he sort of is, depending on how seriously you take those sequels. But in the context of the original Matrix, he is the chosen one. And she says, you're not. She just says, it's not you, kid, or something like that. And then Morpheus says, this is what made me remember it. He says, she told you exactly what you needed to hear.
Because then he eventually just becomes like the reset button.
Yeah. Sometimes, Neo, you're going to find there's a difference between knowing the truth and walking the truth. What is it? Is it an Eastern thing?
I'm not sure if it is or not, but it definitely is a trope. I'm not sure. I don't know where it
feels like that to me, but
I can't think of
have a hard time giving you. You know, my mind goes to like kung fu,
right?
Like grasshopper kung fu,
right?
You know, or like Mr. Miyagi, or
so
any
the conceit
number
of every
like,
samurai movie and a lot of westerns too, of westerns and Easterns, is this powerful character who's a super awesome warrior, but he comes in a package that's very disreputable. And so he walks into a bar, nobody takes him seriously, and you're going to get your arm cut off because you just thought this was an old man, but actually this is an ancient, awesome, cool. You know, that's every kung fu episode. That's every, old samurai in those movies. They wander into a village that everybody just thinks they're a beggar, and then the bad guys make a mistake, and
and then John Wick kills them all.
Right. Exactly. And Gandalf has some of that. The hobbits just think he's this old man that does fireworks.
Right.
And he's not really revealed in his true glory.
So the idea of the reclusive, concealed power of the old wise mentor, that's all over the place. And in a way, you could connect that to the biblical prophets, or to certain of them.
Oh, absolutely. Elijah and Elisha, especially.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking of.
But even Jesus himself, there's lots of stories. There's lots of biblical stories of someone who doesn't look all that powerful, but actually has the power of God. I mean, that's just like, I don't like to talk about the Bible as using tropes or something, but it's a constant theme in the way that God has written history. So I think there's a reason.
Moses is going to walk into the court of Pharaoh with his shepherd's staff and, the stench of sheep on him. 10 plagues later, he's going to march out of Egypt with the whole host of Israel.
And then you make the mistake of going after him again, and your army's going to get swallowed up by the Red Sea. And that is Obi-Wan to some extent, but he is also, and as is Yoda, as is every mentor figure in a lot of these modern properties, he's a trickster. And
Obi-Wan's the consummate trickster in the whole Star Wars universe. Lies and deception and manipulation are sort of Obi-Wan's
his thing.
Shtick. It's like his thing.
Yoda, you just have to get past level 1, and then he'll be straight with you.
Yeah. Once Yoda's like, I'm going to test you. And then once you've passed the test, then we're cool.
Right.
But Obi-Wan, you never really know what it is. He's in some ways, I think it's almost like an unsophisticated person's idea of what a wise man is like.
Yeah, but actually that's not the wise man, George. That's just you not understanding.
Exactly.
You may feel like you've been tricked.
Yeah.
Sure, we've all been felt like we've been tricked, but that's because we tricked ourselves.
Yep.
Well, and maybe that's the whole point. No, it's not.
No, it's not.
It should be.
No.
be nice if it was the whole point.
Well, using the Lord of the Rings again as a foil.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about who is the trickster in that movie, it's Saruman.
Right.
Or that book.
Right.
Yeah.
Saruman's the one who has tricked Gandalf, and then he tries to get Gandalf to see the wisdom behind his trickery.
Right.
In the Silmarillions, Sauron and the other bad guys like him, they were the tricksters. But our culture has this desire to make the trickster into a good guy.
Right.
So, like, for example, Jack, whatever his name is, that pirate.
Jack Sparrow.
Jack Sparrow, or a more famous example would be Loki.
Yeah, right? That's what I was going to say. Yeah. And the Marvel movies have a lot of trouble with this because Loki's supposed to be the bad guy, but he's such a lovable person as a trickster. They keep like wanting us to forget that he's responsible for the murder of, thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah. Well, I might connect it to the ascendancy of nerds in general and the ascendancies, perhaps we could even say, of effeminates. The idea that we don't really like people who just win through their strength. And
we don't like Captain America.
Yeah. As someone that's watching the movie, I don't feel strong. I don't feel empowered. And so, but what I do know is that I'm smart and I can play video game. Just to be a cliche here, I'm somebody that can be clever on the internet, and I can be clever with people. And I the girls don't like me because I'm handsome, but they like me because I'm clever. And so to make that into the heroic quality, that into the way that, that's all that Harry Potter is. If anybody wins, if there's any quality that's really honored in Harry Potter, any virtue, it's just the virtue of being a little bit smarter. That's how Harry wins against Voldemort. He knows something. He has a piece of information. It's not a moral victory. It's my wand works a certain way and I know it, and you're betting against it or you don't know it.
And the part of this is it's like spy movies or anything like that where you do win through trickery. And just think about how the Polyjuice Potion plays such an essential role in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Things seeming one way but actually being another. Right? Like in any Shakespeare play, things that seem one way but are actually another, they're either played for comedic effect or they're going to be
demonstrations of evil. Yeah,
they're going to be the cause of somebody's ruin.
Right.
Yep.
And that's because it is interesting I hadn't thought of this before, but we have, I think it's an immature, it may not be Eastern, but it definitely is an immature way. It's like a child thinking about, well, you've been tricking me the whole time. But no, it's just because I've had authority and I haven't been telling you things.
Right.
It's not because I've been tricking you.
Yeah.
It's because you're not ready for this information. It's like we're getting to a point with our sons where suddenly they're ready for information that's going to be not so fun to talk to them about.
Right.
Yep.
And so it's about this authority and that people have, like elders or pastors. They don't always tell you everything, but they don't trick you. And that's fine. But I think that makes people like Rowling and George Lucas angry that people would actually have that sort of authority over them. And so they just have to imagine that it's all about trickery.
Yeah.
And like it's this cunning deceit that's what's going to win the day. And so they've made what used to be an aspect of villainry, or, in a way, it's also very Greek in its origins.
Yeah, Odysseus
is all about it. Yeah. He's tricking everybody.
Yeah.
But as we talked about, it's just silly that certain people think that makes Homer some wonderful teacher, because all Homer is expounding on the glories of trickery.
Yeah, and Odysseus is just a bad person, and those weird little tricky games that he plays with his wife at the end are weird, and
But the Greeks thought that was fine, but it was about glory and fame. It was not about moral virtue, and so Christianity was supposed to have changed that, and now you want mentors who are wise, legitimately wise, and what you should have is...
And who are good authorities that can be trusted.
Yeah, so how Harry Potter would have worked better is if Harry thought all along that Dumbledore was tricking him, only to find out, no, it's Dumbledore using authority not to give him certain information. And if Dumbledore had ever come out and just said that, it would have been a very different
Well, Dumbledore does come out and say it, but he says that he's wrong.
Apology, yeah.
Yeah.
He says that he was wrong to do that.
Yeah, which was just dumb.
Well, and you could almost maybe pull it off with Star Wars, with Obi-Wan saying, it's a dumb speech. It's one of the dumbest speeches in the original trilogy. You're going to find, Luke, that a lot of things depend on point of view. And from my point of view, but you tweak that speech a little bit, maybe you could turn it into, you weren't ready for this information yet. It doesn't quite get there, but I think it's closer than anything Rowling did with Dumbledore, I suppose. Let's give Obi-Wan a little credit here. You can see the reasons for why Obi-Wan did it. I think maybe it's just that Star Wars is so iconic, I just accept it easier than I accept something that I came to later in life, like Harry Potter. But to me, Obi-Wan's trickery feels a little bit more inevitable than, like with Dumbledore, it's always like, well, the plot needed Harry to not know this.
Yeah.
And you could say
and then it needed to be Dumbledore's fault and not Harry's.
Right. I suppose you could say the same thing about Star Wars. The plot needed to save the big revelation until the end of Act 2. But
you can still find other ways to do that.
Yeah, there are ways to do that.
Lord of the Rings worked just fine, and Gandalf sits down with the hobbits at the very beginning and explains to them what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are still revelations that they come out, but...
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Well, if you were writing Star Wars, here's a fun game. And we don't know that George Lucas really did, but let's say in your second movie at the end, it's going to say, Darth Vader is going to say, "I am your father." And Obi-Wan obviously needs to have this information, but you want to save it for the audience. How do you do it?
I don't mind that specific story that Obi-Wan tells.
I wish that he'd had a better explanation for it later. Like, I don't mind everything that happens in the first two movies. Like, Ben, why didn't you tell me? That's a fun, interesting question. But then Obi-Wan needed
to have a better reason,
a really killer answer for it.
Yeah.
And the killer answer could be as simple as you weren't ready, but he doesn't really say that. He just says some dumb stuff about point of view. And
I mean, if he could have said the good version of, "I sensed in you enough fear already that was going to keep you from fulfilling your destiny. And I was afraid that if I told you that your father turned, that you would have never started down the path to become what you needed to become."
Here's an idea, Luke. You were a petulant brat who was already angry with your uncle for holding you back. And
there's enough of it in you and enough insecurity that what you needed was the confidence. And what I needed to see was, does this kid have what it takes to handle, to really face down, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of facing down the Empire was going to be daunting enough, but having to do it, knowing that you're facing down your own father that you've never met, might have crushed you, and it might never have, we might not be standing here today. Like,
right.
There's a way to tell it that way that works, and that really...
What did you want from me, Luke? By the way, your dad's a big black evil robot, psycho robot. you need to fight him.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to kill him, or turn him to good one way or another. But you're gonna have to face him down.
Right.
And also, he's 10 times more powerful than you.
Right. And he used to be my best friend.
So what are you?
And also, I kind of nearly killed him and left him for dead.
Right. Probably should have finished him off.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a way to do it. I mean, maybe if they'd done it that way, we would have accused it of Dumbledore syndrome a little bit. I don't know, but I think there's a way to do what you're talking about that would work well.
Or Obi-Wan. Here's another idea that works that I think is actually really great. Luke, we ran into each other in the desert, and you came to my place and you started asking questions, and I didn't know what to say.
And then we got involved.
I'm sorry, what do you want?
Then we needed to rescue a princess. And we had like less than 24 hours together.
and maybe I would have figured out a way to tell you, but I died.
Yeah. That's probably the best
I actually think that expecting me to tell you everything about your life story within the first 24 hours of us meeting is kind of a ridiculous expectation for you to place on me.
Luke, you're going to find that a lot of things come down to timing.
Only having 24 hours with you, boy. It's not like I was your headmaster for 7 years.
Oh, man. All right, everybody. Well, this is part 1. We still have to talk about Princess Leia. We still have to talk about the robots. We still have to talk about the Force. We still have to talk about a lot. We still
really have to figure out how to talk about Luke.
Yeah. We will be back probably the week after next, because this podcast is only technically supposed to come out every other week. It's hard for us to actually get into the studio that often. But we will be back week after next with part 2 of A New Hope. And I look forward to seeing you there, Brandon.
Yeah.
Jake.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on the podcast, which was produced by Nathan, executive produced by Nathan and Jake. And until next time,
may the Force be with you.